we're back again, 2:30. We do apologise for the technical issues. If you picture the scene, it's an enormous, well, it's a very, very large airport terminal with nobody in it. So the sound can dissipate very, very quickly around the building, but we're working on it, and we do appreciate the feedback. We wanted to do it live. We didn't want to do a pre-recorded affair today, of all days. But anyway, here we are for the second of our episodes today. There are, of course, 300 stories from 300 children who landed here on the 14th of August, 75 years ago. And I'm delighted to be joined by a second generation member who has a unique story. They're all unique, but this is really very, very interesting because I'm going to let David Shannon, explain about what his family connection is to children who came here and landed here so many years ago. So David, do you want to explain a little bit?
Yeah, so my name's David Shannon. The family name initially was Scheinsdekt, and they were a family from Dęblin in Poland. And Monique and Sesha were two of the Windermere boys, but clearly one girl there. And their cousin Roma was the second one of the girls. And it's a fascinating story. I mean, difficult to go into the detail of it, but it's quite tragic to think about their background and what happened to them. But it's actually a miracle that Sesha, Monique and my father Edic actually survived. Edic was reunited latterly in 1947. That's my dad. So very briefly, Monique, Sesha, my father, Edic, lived really quite a prosperous family background in Dęblin in Poland. And at the beginning of the war, they had a lumber yard, a timber mill. So Dad, Sesha, always remember talking about the smell of sawdust. That was something that brings fond memories to them. They had planned the route out of Poland across to Switzerland, and sadly my father's mother, my grandmother, had died in the ghetto, and my grandfather wasn't sure how he could bring up these three children by himself, so he took in some Hungarian refugees, and their older daughter acted as a housekeeper for them. When the housekeeper discovered that the way out of Poland to Switzerland had been that they bribed their way through, and she wasn't included, she shot them to the Germans. So my grandfather was taken away and shot, and Monique was transferred to the first of the concentration camps. I thought it was Buchenwald, but looking through documents, I think it was another camp before he got to Buchenwald. Now, never underestimate the value of a little black marketeering and a little criminality on the side. Their aunt Eva, that's my grandfather's sister, had married a Polish army officer. She was able to live, she looked quite Gentile, she was able to live outside the ghetto. She paid for Sesha and Edic to be in hiding in Warsaw. She wouldn't keep them herself because that was too risky. So my father and sister, while Monique was in the concentration camp, were in hiding, and Eva paid, because she was quite an adept smuggler, black marketeer, was able to pay for them to stay in hiding. Now, at the time of the Warsaw uprising, there was chaos, and Dad says it was absolute chaos, and they fled, and somehow Sesha ended up in a convent where she wanted to stay because the nuns were taking good care of her, and my dad managed to convince somebody that he was a Gentile, and he'd escaped during the Warsaw uprising, and he was actually working on a farm, and Sesha told me last year he was allegedly very good at looking after geese, and that was his job. So he was able to stay in hiding. Monique, in the concentration camp Buchenwald, was then, as the Allies came across Europe and the Germans were trying to hide, obviously, all the horrors that they were committing, marched or put people on trains or marched them, and Monique ended up in Theresienstadt. Now the story goes, he had befriended an army officer who wanted to take him back, a Russian army officer, who wanted to take him back to Russia. But he said, no, 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 I need to find my brother and sister and see if there's other family members there. So as a 13-year-old boy, which I find remarkable, 13. I mean, I think at 13 I could barely tie my own shoelaces, and doing a tie was probably beyond me. But at 13, he went travelling across Poland from town to town, village to village, orphanage to orphanage, and as he said, there was a lot of orphanages, asking, have you seen my brother? Have you seen my sister? Remarkably, in an orphanage, in a convent, he did find my aunt, his sister, Sesha, and he let her know I understand that the British are going to be taking some refugees back from Theresienstadt to England. We need to go. Now this time, don't ask me how, I wish I knew but I don't, Roma, their cousin, had found Sesha in the convent, and Sesha said, look, I'm not leaving without Roma. Moniek, being forever pragmatic, no, it's about you and me, let's leave Roma behind. But Sesha insisted. So Roma came with them as well. So remarkably, Sesha, Moniek and Roma were on that flight that landed 75 years ago here, on the runway behind us. And when I look around, I mean, there are mountains in front of me at the beauty here, and I think about the ravages of war-torn Europe and what they went through. This really must have been paradise. So they ended up here. We've got this remarkable archive from the World Jewish Relief I've started going through, and there's something from Moniek where the psychologist, a gentleman called Norbert, in the campus assessed Moniek, and he says smokes quite a lot. And put it this way, 75 years later, he's still smoking, and luckily he's still with us. I don't know how, as his son put it, I don't know whether he's done a deal with the devil or with God, but it's remarkable. He survived concentration camps, ghettos, death marches, and he's still with us. Diabetes, an aortic aneurysm, it's a miracle. Sadly, Sesha passed away earlier this year, and she's greatly missed. I did ask her what she remembered about Windermere and about Calgar, and like it's alluded to in Tom's book, she talked about the bread. She said, I had white bread and marmalade. She said, it was like cake. I've never had anything like it. And I think she still kept eating white bread and marmalade for all those years. And I think I realised as well where maybe Paddington Bear got his like for marmalade sandwiches. Probably is the story of the refugees and finding a new life, and how simple things that we take for granted are so very, very important. And the other thing Sesha remembered was the flowers. She said the estate had a lot of flowers. It was beautiful, a sort of beauty that she really hadn't been used to. I think it's hard to imagine the devastation they came from. And I've been back to Poland, and I'm around the Lake District, and trying to imagine what they came from it's next to impossible. But one thing I can say, and I'd like to say on behalf of the family, is how grateful they were to England, the United Kingdom, to the RAF. Moniek actually did national service in the RAF, for the start that it gave them. And I'd like to thank Trevor and the Lake District Holocaust Project for keeping the story alive. Now more than ever, it's really important, and I think when we look back on these 75 years, it's just, we have to remember the start that they came from, and how all of them went on to become such fine, upright citizens. Moniek did the national service, he went over to Canada, set up a life in Canada, had a small business in Canada, worked in a hospital in catering, so a real love of food. Sesha became a teacher, ended up teaching in inner city schools in Montreal. We ought to acknowledge the work that the World Jewish Relief did, in funding, as it was the Jewish Refugees Committee. Everything was funded by the Jewish Refugees Committee. There wasn't really any help from the government, and we need to acknowledge the work that those people did in funding them. When I look at the archive, I mean, things like a toothbrush, underwear, a pair of trousers, all of that was funded by charity. And I think it's very important to remember that. Now, I mean, this day where we're hearing about refugees in boats, people don't leave a country unless there's a good reason. I mean, those were exceptional times back then, but there's hardship all around the world. And I think when you look at the story of the, luckily the survivors who are still with us 75 years later, they've led remarkable lives. And they've contributed so much, and I think we can learn from them. I think it's very important to keep the story alive. It's very important as individuals to think, what can we do? How do we keep the story going? How do we make sure future generations understand? How do we not repeat those mistakes? The mistakes that saw Europe torn to pieces. This can never be allowed to happen again. And I think looking at the beauty of the Lake District where we are now, at the airport here, the RAF, what a start it must have been for them, but how frightened they must have been. So I know now we can look 75 years back, and I think trying to put ourselves in their shoes, I can't even imagine what it would have been like getting on an aeroplane. I mean, if you've never would have been on an aeroplane before. So I think this is an important day. I'd like to thank everybody who's made it possible today, and let's just try and keep positive, looking to the future while we remember the Windermere children, the boys and the girls, and let's just learn the lessons and keep moving forward and keep being nice to each other.
I think that's a brilliant moment to stop. We'll be back later. We'll look more closely at certainly one of the people who was part of the carer team from Central British Front, World Jewish Relief. But we'll be back in a very short while. Thank you, David. That was fantastic.